Money. Never far from our thoughts. So why is it when someone talks about finances we get heavy eyelids, fall asleep, and dream of what we'd do if we were rich? In this podcast series, Kent Tilley does his best to make us yawn with laughter as he delves into gut-busting topics like debt consolidation, asset management, taxation, and budgeting. Still awake? Good. No matter your income level, you will certainly learn something from this series. However, the focus is on underserved low and middle income Canadians who struggle with monthly cash flow and can't get quality advice because they can't afford to access it. In each episode, Kent interviews experts who specialize in helping people get back on their financial feet and get on track. He'll break it down step by step and demystify the process of taking control of your money. If Kent can figure it out, it can't be that hard. Trust me, I've seen him try and fold a fitted sheet. So thank you for listening and welcome.
Hey, everyone. Welcome back to episode 2. I'm sure you're not welcoming back because you haven't listened yet, but we're very lucky to have a special guest on the program today, David Plamondon, based out of Edmonton, I believe now, right? Born in Slave Lake. Does a lot of work with specializing in getting Indigenous people into the workplace and helping through that. So we're going to talk about him and his business and the challenges that he sees and sort of the goals for the future. And hopefully this gives anybody out there looking sort of a stepping stone to find a way to get into the workforce and move forward with your financial and personal life, because I know it's challenging out there for everyone. And so welcome to the show. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on. Very nice to meet you.
Thanks so much, Kent. I'm very excited to chat with you today and hopefully provide some good information to your listeners.
Yeah. And I hope so too. So, first things first, I'm going to learn with the listeners. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So like you said, I grew up in Slave Lake. So for those of you that don't know Alberta, Slave Lake's a small little town in northwestern Alberta, right on the beach of Lesser Slave Lake. So growing up, the town itself had a population of about 5,000, so very small, 250 kilometers away from Edmonton. So not super isolated, but fairly isolated enough, especially growing up pre-internet days. So definitely kind of colored my life experience growing up in a small northern Albertan town. And I moved to Edmonton when I was 17, and I've been here ever since. So coming up on 24 years now in Edmonton. But Alberta born and raised, so always kind of bring a unique or a very specific Albertan perspective to all the work that I do. Yeah,
me as well, for sure. And I've been up to Slave Lake a few times doing some comedy shows and bombing, and then a friend of mine she grew up there, and she's still got a cabin up there. It's beautiful country up there, awesome place. But yeah. Not a town that I know too much about other than they don't like my comedy.
Yeah, it's Slave Lake, and no offense if any of your listeners are from Slave Lake, but Slave Lake is it's the epitome of it's a nice place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there.
Right. That's fair. There's a lot of places like that for sure. So that's you, I guess, in a nutshell, but and then you've got a business, Pe Metawe Consulting and Pe Metawe Gaming. They're tied together. What's the purpose of these businesses? What are you doing? What's the work going into that?
Sure. So we started Pe Metawe Consulting in 2019, April. It was my business partner, Jade Gravel, and I. So we specifically started Pe Metawe in response to some requests that we had from one of the local Indigenous organizations, the Treaty 8 First Nations of Alberta. So they're what's called an IRO, an Indigenous representative organization. So they represent the 24 Treaty 8 nations in Alberta. And so they had a sub office, Treaty 8 Urban Office, which was a CFS support office, a child and family service office. And so the goal originally when they reached out to us was they had wanted to create a platform on social media where their youth could engage and connect. And then we would help create some resources and information to help support wherever they are in their lives, whether it's career planning, education planning, kind of mental health tips, kind of that full suite of services that we would kind of create that content and roll it out. And so Jade and I had worked professionally together before in a few other roles, and I had reached out to her and said, hey, I'm working full time right now. I can't take this work on by myself, but what if you and I connected and maybe brought on 1 or 2 support staff? We formed a little consulting group and we did this work. And so we were very excited about the opportunity. Jade and I had originally connected in previous work, working with the city of Edmonton as part of Indigenous recruitment. And so Indigenous capacity building and kind of helping Indigenous people develop their professional and personal skills is always kind of at the heart of what I've been doing. And I know it's something Jade was passionate about. So being able to work directly with our respective home communities in Treaty 8 and work with youth rather than adults, because that was most of our professional experience, was really exciting to us. And so we sat down and we talked about what we would want to get out of a consulting agency. And so social media isn't really something that either of us were particularly excited about. So this was kind of the means to an end of, let's start with this, build the relationship, build the framework, and then see where we can go from there. And so our original model for Pe Metawe Consulting was that we wanted to work with Indigenous youth. We wanted to develop life skill workshops, particularly implementing tabletop games, so role-playing games, board games, card games, because for me, I grew up as an avid gamer, but again, growing up in a small, isolated town, there wasn't a lot of opportunities. But I see a lot of opportunities to utilize tabletop games to teach a lot of different subjects, numeracy, literacy, collaboration. There's actually a ton of really great board games that kind of focus on economic simulation. So you can actually learn a lot of fundamental economics skill sets and how, closed and open markets work, things like that. And so the original model was, let's take these games, let's build workshop models around them. Let's reach out to communities, Northern Alberta communities, schools, libraries, kind of wherever youth gather, and say, hey, here's an opportunity to engage youth in a way that's going to be fun and engaging, but still meaningful and still have an educational component. So that was really the vision for Pe Metawe Consulting. So we did the social media work. We did some really great work, did some outreach work with some organizations like Edmonton Fire, Edmonton Police. We did a bunch of post-secondary videos. So we created these little informational videos that we shared on the social media platform, but always the vision of growing the business beyond that. So late into 2019, we had started developing a more structured framework of how we would develop these engagement sessions, how we would utilize these games to engage youth. And we're moving towards pilot projects going into January 2020. And then we had a couple schools and libraries that were very excited to bring us in and work with like a small group of youth, kind of test the model, see what works, get feedback, refine it. And that was all scheduled for March 2020. And for those of you who may be familiar with what happened in Canada in March 2020, that was right at the start of when COVID-19 kind of shut everything down. So we said, okay, well, I guess we're not doing that anymore. So we had to pivot. And so since then, we've still always had that at kind of the core ideal of what we want to do, but we've pivoted the business quite a bit, which I think, anyone who's ever been an entrepreneur, anyone who's ever started a small business, there's always that need to pivot around the business model. So for us, we leaned into what we knew. We had already worked with Treaty 8. We'd already had that framework. So they had started asking if there's any way we could help them develop a way for the chiefs to continue to meet, because the chiefs meet on a regular basis, usually several times a month. And of course, middle of a pandemic, they can't really do that. So we basically became subject matter experts in the course of a week or two on how to utilize Zoom. We bought a 24-channel mixer and some microphones and kind of developed that framework of here's how you can meet safely. A couple chiefs could maybe come in, or the administrative staff that's still working in office can meet, but the chiefs can call in remotely. And so we basically built an entire framework where the Treaty 8 chiefs were able to still continue to meet regularly and communicate with one another. And so we've actually continued to do that all the way through the pandemic. And I think it's something that they'll continue to do. So that was really our pivot point, but we still kept at our heart wanting to do that youth engagement work, wanting to do that capacity building. So what we focused on is still refining the model. We've done a couple online sessions in that same vein. We partnered with a nonprofit, the Young Alberta Book Society, who does touring authors throughout Alberta, authors and storytellers. And so the model there was, it was for the Heritage Festival in Alberta in 2021, I want to say. Maybe even 2020. They all kind of blurs together the last 3 years. But essentially the model was that we'd have a professional author, Marty Chan, a very popular young adult author, come in and do a 45-minute presentation on how to create an interesting literary character. And then what we would do is we would come in and we would utilize that framework of making a character and have the youth make a character for a role-playing game, a collaborative storytelling experience. And then we'd run them through a 2-hour role-playing session. And so we did that for the Heritage Festival. I think we had 15 youth participate. And we actually just got an email. I think it was 2020, but we just got an email. No, I apologize. Sorry, 2021. I'm not going to go back and forth. 2021. Right. But we got an email a few weeks ago from a principal at one of the schools that was sent 5 youth to participate in this, and they were saying like they saw even just that 1 3-hour workshop, they saw a noticeable improvement in those youth, a much more interest in like drama and storytelling and language arts, and so it was really inspiring to us because that was fundamentally what we wanted to do, and really. I could talk all day about why we started Pe Metawe. Like the game side just kind of came as a spin-off of that, but I won't waste a bunch of time talking about that. But fundamentally, that's why we started this, was because we saw an opportunity and a need for positive change in the Indigenous communities and communities in general, but particularly in the communities we come from, to address the barriers at a young age and engaging youth while they're still youth, and helping build a better framework for them to engage them in a way that they don't always get engaged. And again, growing up in Slave Lake, I know exactly how difficult it was to access, just normal resources like board games, video games, access to people with a diverse life experience, or diverse set of perspectives. And so, that's something I always carry with me. Like, I carry that kind of impact of growing up in that community with me every day. Obviously, it's a different landscape now than it was 30 years ago when I was a teenager, I guess 25 years ago, with the internet and everything. But I still feel like it's so prevalent that people are always restricted by what they're exposed to. And when you grow up in a small community in Northern Alberta, you're not exposed to a lot of different opportunities or a lot of different industries. And so that's something I carry forward in the work that we do every day. And I always try to keep that in mind, is that, we need to build a platform or a framework for youth to be exposed to more opportunities that they don't otherwise wouldn't normally be. And so that's really the heart of what we do and why we do it.
Right, because they might not even know that there's something out there. It's almost like you're just blinded to the outside world, even though there's internet now. I would feel that that's maybe the case. And I've never lived in a small town, but I know if, you're in a town of 5,000 people with sort of this similar mindset, everybody's lived the same life. You don't even know what's out there, and you kind of get maybe stuck in that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, and it's especially prevalent in like unreserved communities or more the northern, like isolated communities. Like Slave Lake wasn't especially isolated compared to, say, like a Little Red River or even like a High Level, where you 6 months out of the year, you have to rely on the ice roads or you have to fly in, fly out. But then there's just like the logistics. And I think a lot of people underestimate the impacts of growing up in an isolated or a smaller community like that, because the logistics and the economy of scale to bring, anything beyond basic essentials of like food, water, clothing, whatever. Again, I'm obviously very myopically focused towards tabletop games, but there's a ton of cultural value that comes from having access to board games, to role-playing games, even video games, movies, like any kind of art, right? Especially interactive art. And so when you have a small community like that, you don't have, it just doesn't make economic sense to bring that stuff in. So a lot of that stuff just gets missed, right? And so, yeah, it's tricky. And even with the internet, like the reality is with a lot of isolated communities, they don't have reliable access to internet. And even if they do have internet, there's still that same problem of you don't know what you don't know. And so, if you're not exposed to it in your day-to-day life, it's that discovery, right? That's such a key element of growing up is discovering kind of what life has to offer. And so from my own personal perspective, growing up in Slave Lake, the 2 industries we had was oil and gas and forestry. And so, that was kind of the course that was charted for you if you grew up in that environment. Again, this was pre-internet, but that was kind of the industry. So when I moved to Edmonton, I was kind of overwhelmed with options and like, my first job living in Edmonton when I moved here was working at Money Mart, and coming from a small town of 5,000 people, that was essentially akin to working at banking for me. It was a big deal,
right?
And I thought I was, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this podcast.
Of course, sure.
I thought I was hot shit working at Money Mart, right? And I was bragging to my former manager at KFC how I was working at Money Mart, and like just didn't have that perspective because I hadn't, lived in Edmonton. I hadn't grown up in a big environment, so that was like a huge step up. And now, of course, in hindsight, I recognize like how problematic the whole check cashing payday loan industry is,
right.
and and like what a small like what a small job that was compared to like some of the opportunities I've had since then. But again, you have that small pond mentality, right? You don't really know what the opportunities are. So
yeah, you're in the big money game now, right? Like you
exactly.
just you move to the big city, you get in the big money game.
Yeah, country mouse moving on up.
Well, so from a long-term perspective, you're just kind of starting up, and then you got hit with a pandemic, and then you have to pivot. What's the end goal? With 5 years out? What do you guys want to see with the company and what you guys are doing?
So, I mean, that's a pretty loaded question.
Sure.
I say fundamentally, the short answer, the easy answer is we want to have financial stability. I want to not have to stress out about whether or not I can make payroll next month, pay our rent. That's what I'd love to have. But on a grander scale, really our approach to everything we've done, whether it's the consulting work, whether it's the community engagement work, whether it's the retail space, because we do like, and I didn't really talk about it, but just for context, we have our retail. We have a retail space called Pe Metawe Games, which sells tabletop card games, board games, and role-playing games. But our approach to all of that work across the board is to try to decolonize the approach to how business is done. And so for us, I'm lucky. Jade's quite a bit younger than I am, but she's also a lot more progressive. And so she's been really instrumental in kind of helping shape my worldview and reevaluate kind of the capitalist tendencies that kind of are inherent to growing up in Alberta and growing up in oil country. And so for us, like our long-term goal, honestly, is to really kind of reframe how business can be done, whether it's traditional retail, whether it's consulting work. And so that's kind of our tagline is we want to decolonize capitalism, right? Like we obviously can't fundamentally shift the way that the entire world works via capitalism, but we can at least take out some of the more toxic parts of it. So some of the things that we do internally is we try to move to a decentralized hierarchy. So, obviously I'm the owner of the business. Like my title officially is team guide. I don't like manager titles. I don't like supervisor titles. We try to have everyone kind of be responsible for what their kind of sphere of influence is, but, they don't have to necessarily report up to anybody or, answer to anybody other than just, the work itself. Try to keep as much transparency in terms of pay rates, pay cycles, try to be transparent with our internal staff of like what our financial stability looks like, what our financial revenue looks like. We don't obfuscate any of that stuff. Like we don't, we keep all that stuff very transparent. When we approach new contracts, we always try to be as transparent on what our billing looks like and try to minimize any costs that we'll have to our clients. So no padding. Like I know consulting lives or dies off of like, that extra kind of that extra padded work, right? Or that after work or like kind of all these value add things. For us, it's just, we go into it very transparent. Here's the work that we're going to do. Here's what we're going to bill you. And if we say this is what we're going to bill you, that's what we're going to bill you. And then on the retail side of things, it gets a little trickier on retail because retail is so fundamentally, buy and sell, right? It's buy at a wholesale, sell at a retail rate. But for us, it's really about minimalizing how we like trying to move away from some of the traditional retail tactics, preying on FOMO, doing these kind of like flash sales, creating false scarcity. We try to move away from all of those kind of traditional retail tactics and really take a more, again, transparent approach. We have a very fixed markup on our products, so customers kind of have an idea of like what something's going to cost. We don't. I know there's a lot of retail stores, especially in the tabletop industry, that do loss leaders, right? They'll have like this popular game, like, normally it costs $59.99. Everywhere else will charge $40 for it to get them in. And then while they are in the store, they'll impulse buy something that has a much higher markup, right? So we avoid that. We keep a consistent price scheme across everything. And this is very specific to the tabletop industry, but we don't sell any kind of that high turnover, high addictive stuff. Like we don't sell Magic the Gathering or Pokemon cards. We don't sell comics, any of the miniature games, kind of that stuff that's like high revenue drivers for a lot of tabletop stores. We don't really dabble in any of that because it's kind of antithetical to what we want to do, which is really focus on building a community and focusing on the positive aspects of tabletop gaming. And that's not to say that there's anything wrong with playing Magic the Gathering or the Pokemon card game or any of that stuff, but the business model of those games can be very predatory, and it's very much akin to like that dopamine rush of opening a pack of 12 cards that you paid $20 for and then hoping, okay, well, I got to buy another pack to see if I get the cool card I want, right?
Yeah.
And then a lot of that too is also built around the secondhand market as well. So it's buying cards, selling them at a high, and then waiting till those card values go up, and then so a lot of that stuff we try to stay away from because it's just kind of antithetical to the core values that we want to have as a business. And fundamentally, not to put too fine a point on it, but it's also antithetical to how, traditional cultural practices of Indigenous people are, right? And so we always try to, I wasn't raised particularly culturally Indigenous, but as I've gotten older, as I've had the opportunity to work more with the community leaders and the elders and the knowledge keepers, I try to incorporate more of those kind of holistic and traditional values into the work that we do. And so it all kind of coalesces into this, again, decolonized approach to how we do all of our business.
Right. Which is, and I love that because it's not putting money first. I've tried so much with my own business to keep transparency high. When COVID first hit, I remember saying, listen, we are not taking on any new clients because I do not want to drive any fear-based decisions based on what's really happening here. We're just going to focus on helping as many people as we can. And then in the long run, I believe that, well, maybe you won't make the most money, but you will be happier. You'll serve a greater purpose. And so businesses like yours are amazing because it's built on helping, and then hopefully you can see some success, and you should. It just takes a little bit longer generally, and a little bit more stress from trying to pay the bills and the payroll and whatever. So I guess I mean, and I can only begin to understand, but are the challenges with today's youth, Indigenous youth, harder than they were before? It sounds to me like, there's a lot more mental health challenges than even there were before. How can this help, and what can other people do to help, and where can they look to sort of get out of that, I guess, rut?
Yeah. I mean, again, another loaded question.
Right.
I would say that I don't know that it's, I mean, it's hard for me to evaluate whether it's harder for a young Indigenous person than it was for me. But I think, I think the challenges are different. I think for me, again, like talking about my experience pre-internet, it was a lack of direct information. That's obviously a little bit more open now. We've never had as much access to information as we do now. As a whole, there's still a lot of specific problems, with access to reliable internet or infrastructure in Indigenous communities. But I think really fundamentally, a lot of the problems that, again, and it's hard for me to, my perspective as an outsider looking in, because again, I'm far removed from the average young person now.
Right.
But I think it's really fundamentally that, as we move into a more information on the histories of colonization, as you see the discoveries of the residential school deaths, the mass graves, you have a better understanding of what the history of Canada actually is when you look at the history of oppression, things like the residential schools, the 60 scoops, the history of what the RCMP was originally formed to do. You have a lot more insight into it, and so you have Indigenous youth, unlike myself, growing up as a youth, who understand from a historical standpoint what this country did to Indigenous people. But the problem is that doesn't come with any sort of reconciliation, any meaningful reconciliation or steps towards building it. So I think in a sense they almost have it worse, right? Like, I grew up with some, like, I'm what you might call white passing. Like I'm not, I mean, I spent a lot of time indoors over the pandemic, so I haven't gotten a lot of sun. So it definitely means that I have a lighter complexion now, but I kind of can pass off as somewhat racially ambiguous. Like I could pass as like a darker skinned white person or a lighter skinned Indigenous person. I've gotten Hispanic. So like, when it comes to like visual racial profiling, I haven't had as much problems as like colleagues or friends or family that I've had.
Mm-hmm.
But I think those problems always exist for Indigenous people or any person of color. But now, in addition to that kind of institutionalized racism that Indigenous people have to face, you also have that broader and deeper understanding of the history of it as well. Whereas I at least didn't have to face that same kind of level of understanding of like, oh, this isn't something that just impacts me. This is something that's impacted my entire cultural group for hundreds of years, right?
Right.
So I think in a sense they have it a little bit worse because they have to deal with the knowledge and the reality of it. And then, I mean, just fundamentally, like, you see, again, access to information, a lot of progressiveness in terms of like, better education. Like, the quality of living just across the board is much better for people in Canada than it was 20 or 30 years ago. It's not to say it was terrible, but things steadily improve for the most part. But of course, you don't see that same march of progress or support in Indigenous communities, right? And that's something that was, because I grew up in Slave Lake. I didn't grow up in a reserve community. I was kind of, I had to learn all that after the fact. And a lot of the work I've done has been visiting reserve communities and now working with Treaty 8 and going to those communities. You see firsthand, like, the lack of infrastructure, the poor roads, the house maintenance, in a lot of communities across Canada, no access to safe drinking water. You see the monopolization of natural resources that traditionally belong to Indigenous communities, and when I say belong to, I mean post-colonization, when you sign the treaties, right? And I think that's a problem too, is that the more we move forward with kind of addressing Canada's treatment of Indigenous people, the more we learn collectively and individually about the history of those treaties. And things like the Natural Resource Transfer Act, which I didn't learn about until a few years ago, which was Canada offloading its responsibilities from the treaties that were signed to the provinces, so that Canada could essentially circumvent any of their commitments to the treaties, right? So I think the biggest thing, and kind of circling back to solutions and what people can do, is really educate yourself. Understand, in Alberta, we have 3 numbered treaties: Treaty 6 here in central Alberta, Treaty 8 in northern Alberta, and Treaty 7 in southern Alberta. Read those treaties, understand what the basis and the history of those treaties were, because a lot of people don't really understand what a treaty means when it comes to the agreement between 2 sovereign nations. And that's something that we talk about a lot in the allyship workshops that we do, and I hear a lot of our chiefs talk about it, is the concept of sovereignty. When European settlers came to this continent, there were sovereign nations. There were individual tribes and nations that had their own economic standards. They had their own political boundaries and barriers. They had their own interpolitical conflicts. They had their own societal structures, and that gets erased a lot of times with this idea of, like, colonization saved Indigenous people. But the other part that gets forgotten is that European settlers engaged in treaties with those nations. They signed 11 numbered treaties with those nations, which were binding agreements between 2 sovereign nations. So by the very nature of the Crown of England signing those treaties, that was granting sovereignty to Indigenous people. And that just has just kind of fallen out of our collective memory or collective understanding as a society, is that Indigenous people did have sovereignty. They did have sovereignty on these lands and as nations, because it's just kind of been this history written by the victors, but they're still referred to as treaties. And so,
Right.
Understanding the history of treaties, really doing a deep dive or even just a surface level dive of, like, the acts of colonization. So the history of the RCMP, just to give you a very quick crash course, is that they were originally the Northwest Mounted Police, and they were originally formed specifically to enforce the Indian Act and to ensure that Indian people, and I use that term as the correct legal vernacular at the time, and currently still under the Indian Act, would stay on reserve. And they were there to, like, keep Indian people on reserves and make sure they were following the laws of the Indian Act. And then, like, the RCMP have evolved over time, but their roots are still based off of oppressing Indigenous people. And you still see that today with the Wet'suwet'en protesters, and the very different nature between how the Wet'suwet'en protesters were handled and how the Coutts border protesters were handled, or how the protests in Ottawa were handled, the trucker convoy. In one side, on the Wet'suwet'en protesters, you see the RCMP marshaling military force and using near deadly force to remove the Wet'suwet'en protesters. And then on the Coutts border, you see the RCMP at a bar having drinks with the Coutts protesters and then hugging them and shaking their hands as they leave, right? So, it's things like that. It's educating yourself on what it means to be an Indigenous person throughout Canada, not now, but throughout the last several hundred years, right? That's really the thing that I always try to strive to recommend to people, is understand and try to look at it from outside of your own perspective, because I think collectively as humans, that's always the biggest problem we have, is understanding and empathizing from somebody else's perspective, because, again, you don't know what you don't know, and your entire life is informed by your own lived experiences and perspectives, right? So,
well, 100%. It's impossible, and it's why it's sort of easy, even from just a global standpoint, to say, well, that doesn't seem real. Like, say, the war in Ukraine, where it's like, that is absolutely horrific, but I can't understand that that's a reality. So it's pretty easy to disassociate yourself from that. And I mean, from my own perspective, I spent a few weeks working on a reserve, like doing some surveying and seeing what was going on and looking around the town. And that was one with some money and clean drinking water and all of these other things, but still could just sort of notice the problems within the community and nobody knows the right answer to this, that you could debate it forever. But one of the things I think that you're trying to do is find a way to get people who want to out there and find the sort of skill sets to become employable. Because, I mean, is that one of your main goals?
I would say that it's a little bit broader than that specifically. So I can talk a little bit about. So to answer your short question, like the short answer is our goal specifically is to improve capacity for Indigenous people across the board, whatever that looks like. And so as a consulting agency, we have a lot of different framework to do that. So like even in the Zoom facilitation work that we do on behalf of the Treaty 8 nations to help the chiefs get connected, like that does kind of serve that overall goal of building capacity, because it allows them to stay connected and stay communicating and stay proactive towards their common goals and to keep those nations united. I think what you're kind of referring to right now is we're on the tail end of a pre-employment program called Pe Metawe, which translates from Cree to taking care of oneself. And so that was something that Jade and I had pursued very early on when we had started the business, and we had applied for a grant funding under the Youth Employment Skill Strategy, which was administered by Service Canada under the federal government. And so the goal of the YES funding program was it was a 3-year funding cycle, and it was specifically to target marginalized and underrepresented groups, so people with disabilities, Indigenous people, people of color, and I think there was also a stream for newcomers to Canada. And so for us, obviously, it was an easy fit to apply under the Indigenous stream and build a model of workshops to help with that Indigenous capacity building. So we submitted the application. We were made it through a few rounds of screening. They had asked for letters of support from local organizations, which we provided. And then ultimately we were told that we weren't selected, which was fine. We were a brand new organization. We didn't have a lot of capacity at the time. And then it was 2020. They had sent out an email to everyone who had previously submitted saying, hey, if you'd submitted for YES previously, we'd love to hear from you again. Actually, sorry, it was 2021. We'd love to hear from you again. So we said, okay, sure. So we resubmitted an application based on the things that we had learned and based on our expanded staff and capacity. And so they had selected us and said, hey, we'd love to do this. So we're on the tail end of our second cohort. So the program itself, the model was built off of 8 weeks of workshops and skill development delivered and developed by us. So it was really kind of like a comprehensive set of workshops built around like rudimentary stuff, basic budgeting, food planning, workplace etiquette, and then getting into a little bit more employment related specific things like resume development, job search skills, interview skills, some that's what I'm looking for, holistic stuff. So like mental health tips, connecting with community, some elder-led communications. And then we brought in some special guest speakers, so financial planners like yourself, to talk about investment planning, post-secondary representatives. So it was a really kind of broad level of capacity-driven workshops to help prepare these young adults for kind of whatever their next stages of life were. And then paired with that, it was 6 weeks of practicum with external employment partners so that they could actually get some real life work experience working in the field in kind of a more safe and controlled manner, so still supported by us. And so we did our first cohort in 2021, sorry, I think starting in September, going till January. And then we took a little 2-week break, and then we had our second cohort start February of this year. And they're actually just finishing their last week of workshops this week, and then they'll be moving into their practicums next week. So it's been a really good experience for us for the most part. It was a total of 20 Indigenous youth that participated. So the requirements were they had to be between ages 15 and 29. We increased the age to 18 just because of like logistics and the type of employment partners we were working with. We didn't want to complicate things with people who were minors. But yeah, it was, so all in all, it was rewarding, but it was a very challenging program, and it really kind of opened our eyes to a lot of things. And I'm going to drag the Canadian government a little bit here, the bureaucracy.
That's all right.
first and foremost, they didn't really give us a lot of lead time. So I think part of that was impacted by the pandemic. We had applied originally for the program pre-pandemic, before the pandemic was even a thing. And then were rejected before the pandemic was a thing. And then asked to reapply halfway through the cycle that was like mid-pandemic. And so I think, I don't have a ton of insight, but I suspect what happened was they had a lot of programs that they had approved that obviously weren't able to deliver because of the pandemic. So they were probably scrambling to justify or to figure out how they were going to administer the remainder of these funds. So I think the pandemic impacted a little bit, but basically we were given very little notice from between like when we had applied or when we had been approved. Like there was kind of this big gap of like, hey, you've been approved, so we're ready to go, but they didn't tell us anything. And then all of a sudden it was like, okay, you got to start next week and you got to get all these ducks in a row. And then we started the program and they didn't really give us a lot of insight. They gave us a contract that kind of outlined what the obligations were and what the expectations were, but they didn't tell us anything about how they were going to disperse the funds, how they were going to expect us to report on how we use the funds. Like certain like specific guidelines that they came back to us after the fact and said, oh, well, you shouldn't have done this and you shouldn't have done that. And it's just like, well, you didn't communicate that to us. You didn't really give us a lead time. And like, this is our first time with a funded program like this. So why wouldn't you give us this insight? So one major example was the program was built off of, and again, getting into the weeds here, but the contract specifically said that we were allowed to do either practicums or work experience programs. And so the way we structured the first cohort was as a work experience program. And so for us, we thought, okay, well, we'll pay them. They'll basically be Pe Metawe employees. We'll pay them out of the funding disbursement of the money that was administered and budgeted to give to them. The money goes to them as it was supposed to, and we'll place them at external partners. And for us, it made the most sense because a lot of our partners were nonprofit organizations or small independent businesses. And so they don't have the capacity to hire these people on and take on all that extra financial burden that goes with hiring somebody. And then as they're going through their audit from the first cohort, they were like, well, wait a minute, did these people not hire them? And I said, no, we did a work experience program. So we paid them for the government was budgeted to pay for the participation in the workshops. So, and as well as the practicum. So it was all funded programs. So we just figured we were paying them through the workshops. We would continue to pay them through the practicum. And then apparently that was not what we were supposed to do, but nowhere did anyone explain that to us. So it was just kind of like, well, you shouldn't have done that. Well, we can't read your minds. And so like, right. And it's given me a small insight into like the bureaucracy and circling back to kind of, what you talked about with challenges that Indigenous peoples face. I know you said you specifically, but I mean, like this is the level of bureaucracy that Indigenous leaders and governments have to face every day. And when you're talking about some of the things you saw on reserve, another misconception is Indigenous people don't own reserve land. The bands don't own the reserve. That land is owned by the government of Canada. So there's always this ideal or this perspective from uneducated Canadians. Well, why don't they just take care of themselves? If Enoch has so much money, like how do they have such bad drinking water? The reality is the government is who controls that land, and they can't. The nations can't just come in and decide, well, we're just going to build a water plant. They don't have ownership of that land. The government owns that land. They don't decide what happens with that land. The government does. So at the end of the day, Indigenous governments, even a wealthy nation, may have a lot of wealth, but that doesn't mean they have the freedom to just fix all the problems that are there. And at the end of the day, it shouldn't even be their responsibility to do that, right? If you rent a house and your water heater breaks, it's the owner of the house who's responsible for fixing it, not you as a tenant, right? And it's the exact same thing on reserve lands.
That's interesting. I didn't know that at all. Yeah, I mean, 100% makes sense.
Yeah,
because that makes sense now why so many are without water, because if you had the money, you would get it in place. I mean, but
and it's the logistics too, right? The
sure.
Like the intentions of where, like when reserves were originally created, under the Indian Act, the Indigenous people weren't given arable, tractable land. They weren't given ideal land. They were given inhospitable land that's out of the way because, the government, the Crown wanted to prioritize giving that clean arable land to European settlers, right? So it's this catch-22. It's just like, well, if they don't have the capacity to, like, they can't, even if they have the money, they don't have the direct control over the land. The government does. And B, in the case where they don't have the money, like a part of it is like a lot of people are just like, well, why, when you choose to live in an isolated community, well, you didn't choose. You were put there. You were forced there.
Right.
They didn't choose. They didn't say, hey, let's go way up to northern Alberta to the most inhospitable part of the country and let's try to like eke out a living there. No, the government said that. Said you go here. You get to live there where there's nothing, right? And then, when you look at how a lot of, especially in Western Canada, it's a little bit more dense in Eastern Canada, but in Western Canada, like when you look at the Treaty 8 maps where those communities are, they're very, very far away from Edmonton and Calgary, which were the major trading posts at the time, and that was intentional. Let's keep them isolated, let's keep them separated, and let's keep them, these are all consequential acts of genocide that people don't think about when you look at the map and the history of Canada from a long lens. These were intentional acts of genocide. These pieces of land weren't given to us as a gift or kindness. They were given to us in a way to hopefully eliminate the problem, let nature sort it out, right?
Well, you do know if you look and watch and you're like, okay, well, they were, if even the ones that are close to town, for example, Enoch was placed on sand dunes, basically. And you can just kind of look at the landscape and say, well, that is, without doing any research, worth less than anything with forest or whatever. And then sometimes there was sort of a luck aspect of saying, well, we thought that we put them on a shitty piece of land, but all of a sudden they found oil 20, 30, 50 years later. And that was helpful for that community in particular. But for the most part, it's going to work out in the favor of not actually finding good land as far as the Europeans were concerned. And that is pretty apparent to just view from an outside perspective that you don't even know. That's very difficult. I don't know how we solve any of those problems other than hoping to help from an individual perspective is sort of kind of what I'm thinking about on these problems are so huge. We could talk about them all day, but if one person gets helped, then, or you get out and making, and then people see you and then they want, a little bit more. And that's just sort of my thinking is like, that can't hurt. So.
Yeah. And it is gradual, right? And that's the, I think that's why it can get so frustrating. And we see that in leadership, I think, like with Indigenous leadership, but I think we see that in like even like municipal, provincial and federal politics, right? Like non-Indigenous politics, change doesn't happen overnight. And, so that's why, for us, it is gradual change. That's why our approach is always so grassroots, right? Working with youth specifically, working on specifically capacity building for Indigenous youth. You're not going to see it's planting a seed, right? I always use the analogy of a garden, right? Like gardening or growing crops is not something that happens overnight. You don't plant a seed and then get a fully edible plant the next day. It takes, lots of tending, lots of support, lots of growth, lots of, of time and patience. And so, it's tough. Like, I'm 40 now, so I may not see, a lot of, really major change in my lifetime, but hopefully I can plant those seeds that do create a better sustainable, future for Indigenous people. And that's really what our approach is. That's why it's always grassroots for us. It's why it's always focused on youth, right? Building a framework for youth to be able to have those life skills so that they can have an easier progression forward and have a better understanding of where they come from and where they fit into the tableau of Canada and how they can kind of make a better life for themselves.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a noble cause to say the least. Where would, where else would they reach out? What kind of services can they find? Any good ones you can think of that, says this will help you get on your feet. This will give you an education. This will get you into the workforce. This will help you with money. All of these things.
Yeah, it's tough. Our program was funded under Service Canada under a specifically like 3-year funding cycle, but there is an organizational fund called ISETS, the Indigenous Skills Employment Strategy, Indigenous Skills and Employment Training Strategy. So in Alberta, there's 3 ISETS funded organizations. There's Rupert's Land Institute, which I think has 7 locations now across Alberta, and they specifically provide support and funding for Métis people. For the Métis Nations. And then there is Otinawa Employment and Training Society, which is housed out of Edmonton. So they provide support for any urban Indigenous person living in Edmonton, whether they're First Nation or Inuit. And then in Calgary, there's Community Futures, which does the same thing as Otinawa. They service First Nation and Inuit people in terms of providing support for employment and training. The problem is, and this is fundamentally where this cyclical breakdown, and like I said, we've seen it firsthand with how we've interacted with this funding program, is that, and I've worked at OT now, the model, the drive, the vision is really important. They're there to provide support for Indigenous people to get into employment. So they help address employment-related barriers, whether that's training, whether that's certifications, whether that's PPE or like tools, whatever it is, right? If you're a First Nation or Inuit person and you have a barrier to employment, you can go to these organizations theoretically, and they'll put together a plan to help you address those barriers and then provide you some funding. But the problem is twofold, and I've seen it firsthand and secondhand. One, the model for those funded programs is that they're limited to 1 year funding. So, if you want to go to school to become a business person, an entrepreneur, an engineer, a doctor, a lawyer, those programs won't fund you. They'll fund a 1 year program. So very specifically designed for trades or certificate programs, right? Kind of those quick Band-Aid fixes that don't really address the underlying issues of higher education for Indigenous people. And then the second problem is that they're funded under Service Canada. And so ultimately they're evaluated on a very metrics driven basis. They're evaluated based on, okay, here, how much dollars did you spend? How many people did you serve? And most importantly, how many of those people became employed? So they tend to fall into these traps of, okay, well, now we have to really worry about our sustainable funding. So we have to really focus on our metrics, which means we have to focus on getting people employed, which means we have to look for easy fixes. So you're not actually looking at building capacity for Indigenous people in a meaningful way. You're not looking at building a way for an Indigenous person to find a fulfilling career for themselves. You're looking for a way for an Indigenous person to get a job tomorrow. And so, and this isn't a criticism of any of the work that the assets funders do, or the ISETS funders do. It's a criticism of how the model is built, how the funding works, because now you're looking for Band-Aid solutions so that you can pat yourself on the back and say, hey, look at us. We got 5,000 Indigenous people employed this year. But at the end of the day, what does that really matter if those Indigenous people are doing cyclical or seasonal work, or they're doing work that doesn't actually fulfill them, or they're doing work that is, hard physical labor that's going to have an impact on their physical health, or emotionally turbulent labor like healthcare aides and frontline healthcare staff that has a huge impact on their mental health, right? And you're not actually showcasing that you value them as individuals that could have more contributive to the society. And really, to me, it fundamentally circles back to the whole disenfranchisement of the Indian Act, in which that if an Indigenous person under the Indian Act wanted to become a lawyer or a doctor or a soldier, they had to forfeit all of their Indigenous rights. So, on its surface, when you look at it, like, hey, great, there's funding to address these inequalities for Indigenous people in terms of employment. But at the end of the day, what does the actual model look like? It's all Band-Aid fixes, and it doesn't actually get into a holistic approach of let's build a fulfilling and meaningful, sustainable career plan for Indigenous people. And so, that's where the problems come in. So yes, there are resources and assets available, but I mean, at the end of the day, they're all Band-Aid short-term fixes, right? And they don't actually address the underlying challenges in Indigenous communities. Sorry, painted a bleak picture for you.
I was like, there's got to be something good out there, and because
there are people doing great work. So I mean, like,
of course, to close
it off,
sure.
I think we're kind of winnowing in on the end here. So to close it off, I come from post-secondary. I worked for the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology, or NATE, as an Indigenous recruiter. Most of the post-secondary institutions in Alberta have Indigenous support centers. So at NATE, we had the Nisa Kamataton Center. At the University of Alberta, there's the First Peoples House. At MacEwan, there's Kihuwatsidin. The Indigenous Knowledge and Wellness Center out of Concordia, so on and so forth, right? The Lodgepole Center at AU Arts. So fundamentally, at least in the post-secondary environment, there is a little bit of a landscape or a sea change where, like, there is a recognition of needing to create a safe space for Indigenous people so that they feel welcome in post-secondary. And there are people doing great work. I had a conversation today with the new Indigenous recruiter at the University of Lethbridge, right? So there are a lot of Indigenous people that are doing important work in building outreach into the community, and like the work that we do is a very small part of that. We're a very small piece of a much bigger puzzle of momentum going forward. And a lot of the Indigenous leadership, what we work with in Treaty 8, are working towards, getting their sovereignty recognized, of creating their own, Indigenous-led wealth funds. You're seeing more and more Indigenous entrepreneurs. So there is positive change that is happening. I don't want to sound like it's all negative or that I'm super negative on the whole thing. It's just slow going, right? There's a lot of systematic and institutional barriers in place that even when there are solutions like the ISETS funding, like the YES funding that we applied for, there's still a lot of institutional barriers and challenges. And at the end of the day, the bureaucracy always is counterintuitive to progress, right? And so the federal government, of course, by its nature, and I certainly don't want to come off as a libertarian, because I'm definitely not. I'm much more socialist and progressive. But the reality is that the more bloated a bureaucracy gets, the more inefficient it gets, right? And so like that's what you're seeing in a lot of these organizations with Indian Affairs, with I know they're not called Indian Affairs, but the departments of the government that deal with Indigenous people, right? They get entrenched in their bureaucracies and their ways of doing things, and they no longer, they lose sight of the bigger picture of doing good, which was part of the original intent, I think. And they just get fallen into these cycles, and I think that's what happens with a lot of these ISETS funders. And for us too, like we're not inured to it. After doing this 2 cohorts of this federal government program, I don't know that we'll ever want to do one again. Like the
it's because of the barriers that the
lack of communication, the retroactive limitations that they put on us that they didn't communicate to us ahead of time, the monumental amount of like financial reporting. And I mean, I certainly don't expect them to just give us $300,000 and say, okay, go do whatever you want with it. I of course expect them to have some checks and balances, but they didn't communicate any of it to us ahead of time, what we should expect. And so now we're kind of scrambling to figure out these little things, like, and not little things, this whole idea of like, well, we weren't supposed to pay them directly. We should have had the employment partners hire them. And that's a huge barrier because there's telling us halfway through the program that, oh, by the way, you can't pay them directly. You have to have somebody else hire them. Well, that fundamentally changes the entire model of how we built the work experience program. And now you're telling us halfway through, and now we have to scramble to find new employment partners. We can't use the same employment partners because now we're changing the game on them. And so like just those sort of things, right? You just get entrenched in these things. And so, but yes, there is positive change. There is a lot of positive change. It's just slow going. The acts of intergenerational trauma, the acts of colonization, the whole divide and conquer of Indigenous people is really taken root, and you see it a lot. And it's challenging to overcome those mindsets, right? The whole lateral violence or crabs in a bucket ideals are, they're really entrenched because of that intergenerational trauma. So it's really hard to present a united front when your whole history as a people is rooted in oppression and genocide.
Right. Yeah. I can't even imagine, other than, and that is always the problem with government is wanting the results today, but not being forward thinking, because it's about the next election cycle and it's about the budget today. And that is always a challenge that we're going to have to try and overcome as Canadians, and is that, they don't care about 10 years from now, which is problematic from every standpoint, I think of, as far as just money management is like, I can plan for tomorrow very easily, but that'll probably put you in a worse position 20 years from now. And that's the way that they always work. And I can't even imagine how frustrating it is to deal with that. But, at the end of the day, thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for enlightening me on so many things. I mean, I try and keep myself fairly well educated on the issues in this country, and keeping an open mind and talking to people from different walks of life about all sorts of things. But we'll never cover it all. Thanks again for coming on. I hope that you can continue to keep doing your work and helping people, and people like you are what we need. More people like you in this country that are just out there trying to do good and fighting a good fight, and struggling to be an entrepreneur and a startup with good intentions is always very difficult, and you need patience up the yin yang to do that. I know those challenges, so good luck with that. I hope to talk to you more in the future about what we can do. And one thing I think is finding a way to educate not just Indigenous youth, but even every person about basics of financial planning, to give an understanding of, this is what to do with money, and this is, what you need to get a job, and budget, and all of these other things, because having that sort of peace of mind and that in your head makes a world of difference, and not just chasing something for a quick sort of endorphin rush that isn't sustainable.
Yeah.
I mean,
sorry.
no, that's all right. Well, yeah, thank you again, David. It was a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks again for doing the work you're doing and making me a little bit wiser today.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity to come on and chat with you.
Of course. Good luck with the business, and we'll chat with you soon.
Perfect. Thank you.
Beauty. Thanks.